Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're focusing on something, well, incredibly important: men's mental health. You might have seen the statistics, maybe heard snippets in the news, figures around suicide, around help-seeking. And it really begs the question, doesn't it? Why do so many men seem to navigate their inner struggles basically in silence? What are the forces at play here? It's complex. And we're going to delve into it today. If this kind of exploration resonates with you, we'd really appreciate it if you'd subscribe. That way you won't miss our future deep dives. And just want to say this up front. If you're here exploring this topic, maybe feeling some connection to it, please know you're not alone. We really aim for this to be a space for understanding, for clarity on tough issues. We hope you feel seen and, understood and safe here.
Let's start by looking at the scope of the issue, because globally it's quite sobering, actually. Men are significantly more likely to die by suicide than women. That's a stark reality. Yet, almost paradoxically, they are often less likely to seek help when they're struggling.
That contrast is really striking, isn't it? It's clearly not random. It suggests something deeper is going on.
Exactly. It points towards, well, deeper systemic factors. And one of the questions that comes up constantly is, why? Why this reluctance? Why do so many men find it so hard to talk about their mental health?
Yeah, and it seems like a huge piece of that puzzle goes right back to culture. How boys are conditioned, really, from a very young age. This idea that, real men don't cry, that they always have to be tough.
Precisely. Those messages, that pressure to toughen up, they start so early and the impact is profound. Over time, suppressing emotions becomes almost automatic, like a defense mechanism.
Kind of armor.
Yes, exactly, a kind of armor. But while it might seem protective on the surface, it ultimately becomes quite isolating, right? It can prevent real connection and definitely hinders reaching out for support when it's most needed. Think about those common phrases: man up, or worse. They inadvertently teach boys that feeling emotion equals weakness.
Which leads to shame, I imagine, internalized shame.
Absolutely. Internalized shame and this deep-seated avoidance of anything that looks like asking for help.
So it's not that men don't experience depression or anxiety or PTSD.
Yeah.
The same range of challenges anyone else might face.
Not at all. They experience the full spectrum. It's more about how these things manifest and whether men feel they even have permission to acknowledge them.
Permission from society or even from themselves.
Both, I'd say. For instance, depression in men. It often doesn't look like stereotypical sadness. It can show up as, say, increased irritability, a shorter fuse, maybe anger, or even a kind of emotional flatness and apathy.
Okay. And anxiety.
Anxiety might not be voiced as worry. It could be channeled into something else, like working constantly, becoming a workaholic, or maybe needing excessive control over things. And that underlying sadness, it can get masked by sarcasm, maybe aggression, or just pulling away, detachment.
So the silence doesn't mean nothing's happening inside.
Far from it. The silence often signifies major internal turmoil. But without a healthy outlet, or maybe without even knowing what a healthy outlet looks like for them, these conditions wear a different disguise in men sometimes.
And that's made even harder if, as you hinted, maybe they don't even have the words for what they're feeling, the emotional vocabulary.
That is such a critical point. If you haven't been taught the language of emotion, how do you even recognize something's wrong internally? You might just feel off or irritable without understanding the root cause.
Right, so you can't articulate it, maybe even to yourself.
Exactly. And this lack of emotional literacy, unfortunately, can lead towards less helpful coping strategies. Instead of expressing sadness, maybe through tears or talking, someone might withdraw completely, or, as we said, lash out in anger. That's why depression in men is so often missed, I think. It's hidden behind these other behaviors: irritability, substance use, maybe risk-taking.
Which really highlights how vital it is to develop that emotional fluency, that language.
It's fundamental.
And this brings us right back to culture again, doesn't it? This idea of toxic masculinity, though that term can be loaded, but also the myth of stoicism.
Yes, the cultural script is powerful. Real men don't cry. Always be strong, stay in control. It gets deeply embedded. And while maybe the intention behind some of that historically was about building resilience,
Like a survival strategy.
perhaps, but ultimately it acts more like an emotional cage. It seems protective, maybe, from external judgment, but it simultaneously locks away the parts of us that allow for real human connection. Vulnerability, tenderness, the whole range of feelings.
And those little phrases like man up. They seem small, but they carry so much weight, linking feeling with failing almost instantly.
They're incredibly potent, those phrases. They shape how a young person understands emotion and their willingness to ever ask for help. Repeat those messages enough, and you end up with this deeply ingrained belief. Needing help means you're inadequate, weak.
Leading to that emotional isolation you mentioned.
Yes. Isolated not just from others, but from your own inner world, too. And shame becomes this massive gatekeeper. It stops vulnerability in its tracks. It prevents reaching out. That internalized shame, it's a major block to healing.
So, okay, these emotions get pushed down,
Yeah.
ignored. What happens then? They don't just evaporate.
No, definitely not. Repressed emotions have to go somewhere. They often turn inward. Psychologically, this might look like chronic tension, maybe persistent anxiety, or even that emotional numbing we talked about, where you just feel less and less.
Like a defense mechanism kicking in too hard.
Exactly. Or you might see sudden, intense anger outbursts, seemingly out of nowhere. Or the opposite, just complete burnout. And physically, the nervous system can get stuck in that fight, flight, or freeze mode, which has real long-term health consequences.
And you mentioned trauma earlier. It feels like trauma in men is another area that's often missed, especially if it doesn't fit the typical image.
That's a huge point. We tend to think of trauma as, combat or a major accident, very visible things. But for men, trauma can be much quieter, yet just as impactful. Things like emotional neglect in childhood, bullying.
Financial pressure, performance anxiety.
Absolutely. Huge pressures. Or what people sometimes call father wounds, the impact of having an emotionally distant or unavailable father.
Mhm.
These things leave deep marks, but because they aren't always seen as big T trauma, they get ignored, minimized.
By the man himself, too, maybe.
Often, yes, and by society, which can lead to complex issues down the line. See PTSD, for example. These unresolved experiences silently shaping behavior, relationships, without the person even understanding why.
It paints a picture of this outward expectation of strength, but underneath, potentially a real crisis of connection.
That's a very good way to put it. There's immense pressure. Be the provider, the protector, always have it together. But that focus on performance can crowd out genuine connection, real intimacy. Many men say they feel like they don't have anyone they can really be themselves with, warts and all.
Even in friendships.
Friendships can sometimes stay, well, a bit superficial, based on activities maybe, rather than deep emotional sharing. And intimate relationships can struggle too, lacking that true emotional depth. It leads to profound isolation even when surrounded by people. It can be a very lonely place emotionally.
So this constant suppression, this pressure to be silent,
Yeah.
long term, what does that do to a man's overall well-being?
The long-term impact is significant. Chronic suppression doesn't build strength. It actually breeds stagnation. It chips away at mental health. You often see things like low energy, a real lack of joy or enthusiasm, difficulty concentrating, and, as we've said, that underlying anger or irritability.
Like the system is just running on fumes.
Kind of, and over time, the body and mind can start to shut down emotionally, as a defense. This numbing might feel like temporary relief from pain, but it becomes a huge barrier, a barrier to healing and a barrier to connection.
Which brings us, tragically, back to the link between male suicide rates and this difficulty expressing emotional pain.
It's an unavoidable link, unfortunately. The data is stark, as we mentioned at the start. Men represent a disproportionately high number of suicides globally, and this inability or perceived inability to talk about deep emotional pain is a critical factor. If you don't have the words, if you don't have safe spaces to be vulnerable, if seeking help feels like failure.
Then ending the pain might feel like the only option left.
For some, tragically, yes. It can feel like the only escape from unbearable emotional isolation. It just highlights how urgent this whole conversation is.
It really does.
Yeah.
But, and this is crucial, it's not an insurmountable problem. There are ways forward, therapy being a really vital one.
Absolutely. Therapy offers that unique space, confidential, non-judgmental, a place to start taking off the mask, the facade. For many men, it's maybe the first place they feel they can feel without judgment.
Somewhere to just be.
Exactly. Whether it's talk therapy or maybe more body-focused approaches, somatic work, trauma-informed models, therapy helps men reconnect with those silenced parts of themselves. It creates that safe container needed for exploration and healing.
You mentioned somatic therapies, like somatic experiencing, EMDR.
Yes, things like somatic experiencing, EMDR, internal family systems, or IFS, these can be particularly effective. They work with how trauma and emotion are held in the body, helping to release that stored tension, fostering a sense of safety and vulnerability, which is often new territory.
So it's encouraging. There are pathways out of that cycle of silence.
There absolutely are. And a key part of this is redefining strength. Real strength isn't about not feeling. It's about the courage to feel, to acknowledge emotions, understand them, express them healthily.
Developing that emotional fluency we talked about earlier?
Precisely. Learning to name feelings, fear, sadness, joy, grief.
Hmm.
It builds self-awareness. It strengthens relationships, makes them more authentic. It's about becoming whole, not just tough.
That touches on something else too, generational patterns, father wounds, legacy trauma. These seem significant.
Hugely significant. Many men grew up with emotionally unavailable fathers, who themselves likely grew up the same way. It's a cycle of silence. Breaking that cycle involves confronting those intergenerational patterns, grieving unmet needs, practicing self-compassion.
Which then allows them to be different kinds of fathers themselves.
Hopefully, yes. To raise emotionally healthier sons and daughters too, of course. It's about changing the legacy.
And what about peer support? Healthy male friendships.
Critically important. But it often requires intentionality, moving beyond just shared activities into spaces where real vulnerability is possible. Things like men's support groups, men's circles, places where men can actually talk about difficult emotions without fear of ridicule.
Creating those safe spaces you mentioned.
Exactly. Safe spaces are essential for practice, for building trust and vulnerability.
Another question that often comes up, is it too late? Can men heal from this emotional repression later in life?
Oh, absolutely yes. A resounding yes. Emotional fluency can be learned at any age. Healing is always possible. It takes intention, the right support, and courage, but it's never too late to start that journey.
That's really hopeful.
That is.
So as we start to wrap up this deep dive, it feels like the men's mental health crisis is fundamentally about connection, doesn't it? A deep human need.
I believe so. At its core, it's about connection. Connection to oneself, connection to others. Healing really starts when men give themselves permission. Permission to feel, to speak, maybe even to cry, to embrace their full humanity. The goal isn't about making men stronger in that old Stoic sense. It's of making men freer.
Freer. Freer to live fully, love deeply, shed that burden of silence.
Exactly.
That's a powerful note to reflect on. Maybe a final thought for our listeners. How might this societal pressure towards stoicism be impacting all of us, really, regardless of gender?
Right.
What could it look like if our culture truly saw emotional expression as strength? For everyone.
That's a big question, and a vital one to keep asking.
Indeed. Well, thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us today into the complexities of men's mental health. We genuinely hope this has offered some valuable insights, maybe sparked some new perspectives for you listening. If you found this conversation helpful, please do subscribe to the Deep Dive channel. We'd love to have you join us for more in-depth discussions on important topics like this. Thanks for listening.